Have you been wondering as to why the price of goods and services is different from the previous years? Or have you ever thought as to why the price of meat, especially pork and chicken, has taken its toll to increase lucratively? Have you ever wondered the increase of fare when you rode a public transportation? Or just by merely realizing that your usual grocery budget in a week can no longer suffice the needs for the entire week? And yet, your monthly income has been the same over the years? Well, simply because of inflation. And that is what we're going to talk about today. Inflation is the decline of purchasing power of a given period of time. A quantitative estimate of the rate at which the decline in purchasing power occurs can be reflected in the increase of an average price level of a basket of selected goods and services in an economy over a period of time. Inflation in general refers to the increase in the prices of goods and services in the economy over a period that corresponds with a decrease in the value of money. The simple definition of inflation is the sustained upward movement in the overall price of goods and services in the economy. It has the effect of devaluing a particular currency. When a unit of currency depreciates its value, so does purchasing power, as it takes more currency units to buy the same amount of goods and services than it did in the past. In other words, your money buys you less stuff, be it bread, toothpaste, rent, or medical checkups. Now, moving forward, let us discuss about what are the causes of inflation. Many consumers erroneously associate inflation with the rise in the price of a few key goods and services such as oil, or even a particular industry, such as real estate. But inflation is by definition only present when the overall price of goods and services is rising. Three main forces are thought to be responsible for this increase in the economy-wide prices of goods and services, namely demand pull inflation, cost push inflation, and built-in inflation. So let us tackle first what is demand pull inflation. Now let us talk deeper as to what with demand pull inflation is all about. This is asserted to arise when aggregate demand in the economy outspaces aggregate supply. It involves inflation rising as a real gross domestic product rises and unemployment falls, as the economy moves along the Philip curve. This is commonly described as too much money chasing too few goods. More accurately, it should be described as involving too much money spent chasing too few goods. In the given diagram, it shows that increased employment results in increased aggregate demand or AD, which leads to further hiring by firms to increase output. Due to capacity constraints, this increase in output will eventually become so small that the price of good will rise. Cost-pushed inflation, which is also called supply shock inflation, is caused by a drop in aggregate supply, which is the potential output. This may be due to natural disasters or increased price of inputs. This phenomenon wherein the rising price of input goods and services increase the price of final goods and services and causes inflation. One example of a cost-pushed inflation is a sudden decrease in the supply of oil, leading to increased oil price, which can cause cost-pushed inflation. Producer for whom oil is a part of their cost could then pass this on to the consumer in the form of increased prices. The third cost of inflation is what you call built-in inflation. It is a type of inflation that results from past events and persists even in the present, which is induced by adaptive expectation and is often linked to the price-wage spiral. It involves workers trying to keep their wages up with prices above the rate of inflation. and firms passing this higher labor cost on to their customers as higher prices, leading to a feedback loop. Built-in inflation reflects events in the past and so might be seen as a hangover inflation. How to measure inflation? The inflation rate is typically measured by changes in something called a price index. The most popular price index is the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, which is a measure of the average change over time in the price of a standard set of customers, goods and services known as market basket. For us to be able to get the calculation of the Consumer Price Index, we have to calculate it by dividing the price of a market basket in a particular year with the price of the basket in the base year. So you have here the formula. If we are going to look at the data that we have here, we have a consumer price index for 2018 which is 120.17, while we have a price of 124.95 for 2019. For us to be able to get the inflation percentage of the given data, we have to make use of the formula. So inflation is equal to consumer price index of 2019 less the consumer price index of 2018 divided by the consumer price index of 2018, which will give us an inflation percentage of 3.98. About what are the effects of inflation? So there are two things that we have to consider, the positive and the negative. So we have to discuss first what are the negative. So high or unpredictable inflation rates are regarded as harmful to an overall economy. They add inefficiency in the market and make it difficult for companies to budget or plan long term. Inflation can act as a drag on productivity as companies are forced to shift resources from products and services to focus on profit and losses from currency inflation. Uncertainty about the future, purchasing power of money discourages investment and savings. The following are the negative effects of inflation. First is hoarding. People buy durable and non-perishable commodities and other goods to avoid losses expected from the declining purchasing power, which creates shortage of the hoarded goods. Social unrest and revolts. Inflation can lead to massive demonstration and revolution. Other negative effects of inflation is hyperinflation. If inflation becomes too high, it can cause people to severely curtail their use of the currency, leading to an acceleration in the inflation rate. High and accelerating inflation grossly interferes with the normal workings of the economy, hurting its ability to supply goods. Hyperinflation can lead to the abandonment of the use of the country's currency, leading to the adoption of an external currency. Allocative efficiency. A change in the supply or demand for a good will normally cause its relative price to change, signaling the buyers and sellers that they should reallocate resources in response to the new market condition. But when prices are constantly challenging due to inflation, price changes due to genuine relative price signals are difficult to distinguish from price changes due to general inflation, so agents are slow to respond to them. The result is loss of allocative efficiency. Shoe leather cost. High inflation increases the opportunity cost of holding cash balances and can induce people to hold a greater portion of their assets in interest-paying accounts. However, since cash is still needed to carry out transactions, this means that more trips to banks are necessary to make withdrawals, wearing out the shoe leather with each trip. Lastly is the menu cost. With high inflation, firms must change their prices often to keep up with the economy's wide changes. But often, changing prices itself a costly activity whether explicitly as with the need to print new menus or explicitly with the extra time and effort needed to change price constantly. Now let us discuss the positive side of inflation. First is a room to maneuver. The primary tools for controlling the money supply are the ability to set discount rate, the rate at which banks can borrow from the central bank, and open market operations, which are the central bank's intervention in the bonds market with the aim of affecting the nominal interest rate. If an economy finds itself in a recession with already low or even zero nominal interest rates, then the bank cannot cut these rates further. This situation is known as liquidity trap. Another positive effect of inflation is the Mondale-Tobin effect. The Nobel laureate Robert Mondale noted that moderate inflation would induce savers to substitute lending for some money holding as a means to finance future spending. That substitutions would cause market clearing real estate interest to fall. The lower rate of interest would induce more borrowing to finance investment. The third positive effect of inflation is instability with deflation. Economist S.C. Chang noted that once substantial deflation is expected, two important effects will appear, both as a result of money holding substituting for lending as a vehicle for saving. The first was that continually falling prices and that the result incentive to hoard money will cause instability resulting from the likely increasing fear while money hoards grow in value. That the value of those hoards are at risk as people realize that movement to trade to those monies hoard for real goods and assets will quickly drive those prices up. Any movement to spend those hoards once started would become a tremendous avalanche which could rampage for a long period of time before it appears to be spent itself. Thus, a regime of long-term deflation is likely to be interrupted by periodic spikes of rapid inflation and consequent real economic disruptions. Moderate and stable inflation would avoid such swaying of price movement. Types of inflation. As the nature of inflation is not uniform in economy, for all the time, it is wise to distinguish between different types of inflation. Such analysis is useful to study the distributional and other effects of inflation as well as to recommend anti-inflationary policies. Inflation may be carried by a variety of factors. Its intensity or pace may be different at different times. It may also be classified in accordance with the reaction of the government towards inflation. The different types of inflation accordance to the basis of causes. First is we have currency inflation. This type of inflation is caused by the printing of currency notes. Credit inflation. Being profit-making institutions, commercial banks sanctions more loans and advances to the public than what the economy needs. Such credit expansions lead to a rise in price level. Another type of inflation is the deficit-induced inflation. The budget of the government reflects a deficit when expenditure exceeds revenue. To meet this gap, the government may ask the central bank to print additional money. Since pumping of the additional money is required to meet the budget deficit, any price rise may be called the deficit-induced inflation. Another type of inflation is the demand pool inflation. An increase in aggregate demand over the available output leads to a rise in the price level. Such inflation is called demand pool inflation or DPI. But why does aggregate demand rise? Classical economists attribute this rise in aggregate demand to money supply. If the supply for money in an economy exceeds the available goods and services, DPI appears. It has been described as the cool born in a situation of too much money chasing too few goods. Cost-pushed inflation is another type of inflation. Inflation in an economy may arise from the overall increase in the cost of production. This type of inflation is known as a cost-pushed inflation, or CPI. Cost of production may rise due to an increase in the prices of raw materials, wages, and others. Often, trade unions are blamed for the wage rise since wage rate is not completely market determined. Higher wage means higher cost of production. Prices of commodities are thereby increased. A wage price spiral comes into operation. But at the same time, firms are to blame also for the price rise since they simply raise prices to expand their profit margins. A type of inflation which is based on speed or intensity. First is we have the creeping or mild inflation. If the speed of upward thrust in prices is slow but small, then we have a creeping inflation. What speed of annual price rise is a creeping one has not been stated by the economists. To some, creeping or mild inflation is one when annual price rise between 2 PC and 3 PC. If a rate of a price is kept at this level, it is considered to be helpful for the economic development. Other arguments that if annual price goes rise beyond 3 PC mark, still it is considered to be a no danger. Walking inflation. If the rate of annual price increase lies between 3 PC and 4 PC, then we have a situation of walking inflation. When mild inflation is allowed to fan out, walking inflation appears. These two types of inflation may be described as moderate inflation. Often, one-digit inflation rate is called moderate inflation, which is not only predictable but also keep people's faith on the monetary system of the country. People's confidence gets lost once moderately maintained rate of inflation goes out of control and the economy is then caught with the galloping inflation. Galloping and hyperinflation. Walking inflation may be converted into running inflation. Running inflation is already dangerous. If it is not controlled, it may ultimately be converted to galloping or hyperinflation. It is an extreme form of inflation when an economy gets shattered. Inflation in the doubt or triple-digit range a year is labeled galloping inflation. Government's reaction to inflation. Inflation situation may be open or suppressed. Because of anti-inflationary policies pursued by the government, inflation may not be an embarrassing one. For instance, increase in income leads to an increase in consumption spending while pulls the price level up. If the consumption spending is countered by the government by a price control and rationing device, the inflationary situation may be called a suppressed one. Once the government curbs are lifted, the suppressed inflation becomes an open inflation. Open inflation may then result in hyperinflation. Inflation rate. The inflation rate is the percentage increase or decrease in prices during a specified period, usually a month or a year. The percentage tells you how quickly price rose during that period. For example, if the inflation rate for a gallon of gas is 2% per year, then gas prices will be 2% higher on the next year. The Philippine inflation rate spiked to 4.7% in February of 2021, the highest since the 4.4% recorded in January 2019. It is also the fifth straight month increase and follows the 4.2% inflation rate in January of 2021. A year ago, in February 2020, the rate of increase in the prices of goods was only at 2.6%. National statistician Dennis Maba said on Friday, March 5, that the uptick was mainly caused by the increase in meat prices, which had an inflation rate of 20.7% on February 2021 from 17.1% in January 2021. In particular, pork prices have been surging. Hog raisers attribute this to the African swine fever outbreak. President Rodrigo Duterte imposed a 60-day price ceiling on pork and chicken prices starting February, but it backfired instead of prompting vendors to stop selling. Economists from the academe have urged Duterte to scrap the price ceiling, pointing out that it's not solving the problem of high prices.